Airline has its own stories. Legends and myths that have been retold for years, and everybody has heard. And at my old airline, the one that I'm about to tell you was probably one of the most famous ones I heard. Although, up until recently, I had only ever heard the punchline, the jaw-dropping bit that was recirculated. So you can imagine my excitement when I finally got to hear the whole thing from somebody who was there. Yes, for those of you that were in the dark as much as I was, I can confirm that I have been given this story straight from the mouth of someone who was there. I've got the bit before, the bit we all know, and what came after. No more need to make up those bits or imagine what they were, because this week we are bringing you the whole story of the sofa that slipped out of the window. Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the red eye! Whoa! Welcome aboard the Red Eye. Johannesburg, 1999. Dave, the captain, knew from the trip before that the lad was potentially trouble because cheeky, good-looking, full of energy like a greyhound puppy, Alex was him. He was exactly the lad he had been 30 years ago, and after being on his very first flight only last week to San Francisco, he had a feeling that Johannesburg was going to unleash him. The food, the cheap wine, the thinner air up here at 6,000 feet, the room party, the young girls on the crew, all of it. He just hoped that he, and indeed the others, knew when to draw the line. Because while he was all up for fun, in fact he positively insisted on it, he had a round of golf in the morning and was kind of hoping to be in bed for midnight and not calming down security. They were a good group though, behaving exactly how they should be at their age, in this job, he thought as he watched them from the head of the dinner table. He'd provided drinks in the crew room beforehand, and the wine was free-flowing all evening. And yet, while the laughter was louder, they all seemed to be still in control of their senses, which he wasn't quite sure he could have said about himself at their age, when he'd been in the military, and got up to things much wilder than anything he'd seen at the airlines. Well, so far anyway. "I'll see you all in the morning, and please don't upset the hotel," he pleaded, waving them off at the lifts a little while later. It was midnight, and his golf pickup was at 8 a.m. It was summer here in South Africa, and the mornings were perfect for a round of two. But by the afternoon, the sun was far too hot for a pale British pilot to weather. Time to sleep off this wine and start the day off afresh. The others, he already knew, were heading straight back to the crew room. But they still seemed half sensible, he told himself. And he said a silent prayer that they would behave. Back in the crew room, Alex pulled back the window to breathe in the night air, feeling the kind of exhilaration that comes from being somewhere completely new and knowing you've finally arrived. Because he was having the time of his life. A boy from the countryside who'd only ever worked in a supermarket, and here he was, in South Africa, surrounded by a group of like-minded people, laughing louder than he ever had, drinking more than he ever had, and feeling as though he'd stepped into a whole new world where anything was possible. Outside the window, he looked down 13 floors to the street below. Alongside, he took in the wide window ledge that he hadn't noticed earlier, but had heard about over dinner as Paul the purser told him about how they'd sometimes run along it and get into other rooms if their windows were open. It had sounded like a great game. Indeed, the way Paul had told it, it had sounded hilarious, but perhaps not one that he would play himself. Not this high up. His stomach lurched slightly as he imagined the fall, and he pulled his body back in, just as something flew past his head. He jumped back, his body tensing instinctively as if to brace for impact, and then put his head back through the window, watching as whatever it was spun all the way down before landing, a small speck on the street below. "What the hell?" someone cried. It had been a pair of shoes that had flown past him, their laces tied together, and those shoes belonged to Joe, who was now standing looking from his socked feet to the pair who were laughing. His face said that he was less than amused, his jaw tightening. Alex could see that he was trying to look calm, but his eyes were telling a different story. Alex looked out of the window, so small from this distance that they were almost invisible. He could just make out the shoes lying in the lamplight below. "They're just on the street, mate. I can see 'em." Joe huffed and turned to leave. "Well, I guess I'll have to go and get them then." "Quick, before someone nicks them," someone called after him, and the laughter resumed. Louder now, as though the risk of losing the shoes had made the whole situation even more hilarious. When he was gone, there was a brief moment when no one spoke. A small gap in the laughter that needed to be filled because silence was dangerous and momentum mattered. It was Paul who filled it, who suggested the next move in the game, the thing that would keep the fun going. "He left his key," said Paul, holding the metal key on its wooden keyring in the air. "Maybe we should prank him." And so began the part where things would go wrong. The part where half a dozen crew, fueled by buckets of wine and a skinful of shots, might have crossed a line of where their humour should probably have ended. With all of them in Joe's room, on the other side of the landing, overlooking the car park roof and the mall, someone came up with an idea. "Let's hide his stuff," they said. "On the window ledge," Alex said. The room fell silent as they each thought about that, and Alex grinned, proud of his ingenuity. And that was that. No one said a word, but it was decided. Piece by piece, they fed Joe's belongings through the window. His uniform, his wash bag, his case, balancing each of them carefully on the ledge. Well, as carefully as they could in their conditions anyway. Joe, meanwhile, was still heading down in the lift to collect his shoes, with no idea that everything he owned could well follow them at any moment. And then someone came up with another idea. Oh, it was a great one. A hilarious one. One that had never been done before and would possibly make them the funniest crew in the air. "We should hide his furniture," they said, and a cheer of agreement went up. Now, we wonder if that person had perhaps meant something different. Perhaps popping the lamp behind the curtain was what they intended, or the desk chair in the bath. But whatever they had meant, Alex felt something in his brain unleash. Oh, this was his new life. This was his world. And in a life where he got to do things better than everyone else, so too would he prank better. "Furniture," they'd said. Well, why start small, he thought, looking at the piece nearest the window and raising one end from the floor. "Let's get this out, and then we can all be sat on it when he gets back." And so began the part of the story we all knew at my old airline. The sofa. A small 2-seat bedroom piece was lifted from the floor. "Are you sure about this?" someone at the end furthest from the window asked. Alex was surer than he had ever been. And what he didn't tell them yet was that once it was out there, he planned to sit on that sofa and light up a cigarette, overlooking the South African night. It was, he thought, the best idea he had ever had. "I'll just lift it," he said with a grin. Soon, everyone was invested. A dozen hands trying to help in a chaotic scene straight out of the Chuckle Brothers. "To me, to you, tip it left, tip it right." They tilted and repositioned, lifted and lowered it until, eventually, Alex's end of the sofa was through the window. The rest followed easily enough. Alex reached out as far as he could, guiding the front legs so they rested on the ledge. Only he could fit through the narrow gap alongside the sofa, and it took some effort, but he could do it. He just needed to... "Stop!" he yelled to whoever was still pushing. He needed to nudge it a little further in, just a fraction, but they didn't stop pushing and... Shit! One stubby wooden leg wobbled on the edge for a moment before slipping over. Alex tried to stop it, he really did, but as the rest of the sofa began to follow, the back leg he grabbed slid out of his hands, and the sofa fell. The poor, unfortunate sofa fell to its end, hurtling down the floors until it smashed into pieces on the roof below. At the far end of the car park, a security guard stopped mid-step and watched as something dropped from a hotel window. He heard the almighty crash, and when he looked up to see half a dozen heads, all open-mouthed, staring down from a window on the 13th floor, he knew exactly who they were. He had worked there long enough. Oops. They all jumped back inside, and Alex pulled the window shut quickly. Just as it closed, the bedroom door pushed open, left on the latch by someone earlier. Joe stopped in the doorway and stared at them. His shoes were back on his feet, and the confusion on his face was immediate. "What are you all doing in here?" he asked, casting his eye around the room, and then turning to the window and finally noticing the neat line of his belongings balanced on the ledge beyond the glass. "What have you done?" he said, afraid to hear the answer, wondering how far they had taken it. "What have you done?" Eduardo was speechless, which in 10 years of hotel management was no small thing. He'd come from South America to be part of the management team, and in that time he had developed a healthy tolerance for airline crew and their particular brand of chaos. He'd seen it all, and he knew that on most nights security would be knocking on at least one crew member's door, politely requesting that they keep the noise down. He had seen them racing down corridors half naked, accosting national cricket teams and encouraging them to drink the night before a game, wine stains on carpets he preferred not to remember, and he had personally shut down parties when security had simply given up. He had seen it all. Or so he thought. This, however, felt like a new level of commitment. This was not noise. This was architecture. "Someone could have been killed," he said, scratching the back of his head. "Indeed," said the security guard, who had just returned from inspecting the scene and was still slightly pale. It could have easily have been him. There was little left of the sofa. It had been reduced to splinters on the car park roof, gravity having done what gravity always does when given time and encouragement. If it had been daytime, if anyone had been standing beneath that window, they would not have survived. Eduardo lowered himself into a chair and let out a long, tired sigh. He did not like trouble. He did not like paperwork or reports. He liked an easy life, quiet nights and problems that resolved themselves. Unfortunately, none of those applied here. This could not be ignored, and someone was going to have to be held accountable. He picked up the phone and called the hotel operator. In his room, the captain was just waking up. A full day of sunshine and golf ahead of him. He had learned in recent years when he'd had enough to drink, and so these days his head was always clear in the mornings, and he liked it that way. He stood up and stretched, loosening his muscles as he took a slow practice swing. And then the phone rang. He glanced at the clock, confirming it was only 7 a.m. and picked up the receiver, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. Before Eduardo had even spoken, he knew something had happened.
Sorry, Captain, sorry to disturb you, but your crew, they threw a sofa out of a window last night.
It took a moment for the sentence to land, and then another for Dave to work out what he was supposed to say in response. Eventually, only 2 words came out. "Oh dear."
Yes. Oh dear.
Eduardo repeated.
They could have killed someone, Captain. What would you suggest we do about it?
Dave's brain had only just woken up. If Eduardo had asked him what to do about an engine failure or a diversion, he could have answered instantly after years of training. But what to do about a feral crew throwing a sofa out of a window at 7 in the morning was not covered in any manual he'd ever read. "Oh, he stammered. "Okay, leave it with me."
Okay, Captain.
Dave hung up and sat back down on the edge of the bed. He pictured the manager, a man he knew after years of coming here, and a man he didn't particularly like. Always a bit sleazy around the girls, and, like a lot of men with a medium amount of power, corrupt as they came. And then a memory surfaced. Something from his time in the military. In fact, several memories did. Stupid stunts pulled by overexcited new recruits. And those, he remembered, sitting up a little straighter, were always smoothed over as long as you did one thing. You paid your way out of it. He picked up the A4 sheet on the desk and scanned down the printed crew list. When his eyes reached Alex's name at the bottom, he knew instinctively that he was involved. He picked up the phone and dialed Alex's room. In his bed, Alex was fast asleep. Mouth open, lips faintly stained with red wine. Left undisturbed, he might have slept another 6 hours. But when the phone rang, his stomach dipped immediately, the unmistakable sense that trouble was calling. "Hello? Hello?" he answered, his voice thick as he coughed to clear it. On the other end, he recognised Dave's voice instantly.
Alex, if I asked you about sofas and windows and car park roofs...
Alex was wide awake now, the night flashing back in sharp, unwelcome images that made his whole body stiffen.
Would you know anything about it?
For a moment, he considered denying it. But there was no point. Whether they could prove who actually did it or not, there was no way he could escape the fact that he had been involved.
Look,
Dave cut him off. He didn't want the story. He didn't want to play judge and jury. He wanted to go and play golf.
Look, you and whoever else was involved need to call the manager, Eduardo, now and go and see him. You need to offer to pay for the damages and give him whatever he asks for. And you need to hope and pray that this goes away after, okay?
Alex nodded, although Dave couldn't see it.
Okay?
Dave asked again. "Yes, Captain." Dave had pushed it to the back of his mind while he was out on the course, but as he stepped back into the hotel lobby, he took a deep breath, his eyes flicking left and right in case someone was waiting for him. No one was. As he stepped into the lift, he let out the breath he'd been holding and allowed himself to hope that it meant it had all been dealt with. There was always the phone, though, which he hoped would not be flashing when he finally got back to his room. He took a detour via the bar and greeted Jocelyn, the barmaid who'd worked there for years. "Your usual, Captain?" she asked. "Well, you know me." Jocelyn poured a glass of cold draft beer, exactly what he needed after the heat of the golf course. "Captain," she said, placing it in front of him, Were you involved with the crew who threw the sofa out of the window last night? Dave froze, the glass hovering halfway to his mouth, his stomach sinking. Oh, does everyone know about it? Oh, yes, she chuckled. And your boys. I saw them laughing after they'd been to see Eduardo. They think they got away with it. Boys, she added, shaking her head as she turned away. Dave lowered the glass and sighed. He had intended to file a report that evening, play it down a little, say it had been dealt with, to try and help them out. But it stung a bit that they were laughing, that they were naive enough to think that they'd gotten away with it completely. Even in the military, stories like that never really went away, no matter how many times you tried to bury them. And as it turned out, this one didn't either. So, as the story goes, the manager who arrived the next day heard what had happened and reported it back to base, with none of Dave's playing it down. He was horrified by what the crew had done, not just because of the damage, but because of the sheer recklessness of it. And, he wasn't one to see the funny side at the best of times either. And the base was, after hearing his aggressive account, equally horrified. They insisted the crew involved be held accountable. And so, as we're told, anyone who held a rank higher than junior was demoted, and the others were issued warnings for the parts they had played. In a world that is less tolerant now, where everything is on camera and one mistake can cost you a career, we have to say that they might have just got away with things lightly. These days, we're pretty sure crew lose their jobs for much less. I've heard of someone losing their job for stealing a muffin off a breakfast tray. And after all, the stupidity really could have gotten someone killed that night. A passerby in the car park, a cleaner, a security guard, anyone could have been beneath that window at the wrong moment. So perhaps a demotion was, in truth, a small price to pay. But whatever side of the fence you sit on, whatever opinion you may have, the drunken antics of those crew that night did give us something quite special. They gave us a story that has been retold as many times as the earth has spun. They've raised laughs around dinner tables, gasps on jump seats at 3 a.m, and those knowing smiles that only people who've heard it before can share. They have gone down in legend. And, well, we think you'll agree that there is something kind of cool about that.
The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylie Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.